after the deadline that I gave them. So David has asked for me to announce that his talk will be about teaching in West Africa, especially Sierra Leone and Ghana. So a little bit more detail there about what he's going to be talking about. I don't need to do the emergency exits talk or where the toilets are, because you've all been here before. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who is actually going to be hosting this series. Thank you.
Well, good evening and welcome to anyone who's joining us at home as well, or on recorded versions later. Lovely to have you with us. My job is to host on this occasion and to welcome someone who really, David doesn't really need that much introduction, as he knows us all very well. And we all tend to know him, although if you haven't met him or anyone's joining online, David Morgan has been a regular contributor to the life of this church over the years. So in a sense, I'm just welcoming him back. Now, David did say, and I thought it was very blunt of him, that he hoped I would be brief tonight. So, which he knows me with, yes, which may come from experience. So I shall simply say, David, we welcome you. Would you like to come and join us here at the front? I'm simply going to describe your talk as Memories of a Bible Translator and leave the rest to you and other pronunciations. But welcome. We'll talk to you again at the end, and there may well be 100 questions, but we're very, very pleased to have you with us, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? It's working okay? Good. And excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. I'm not really quite sure. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I guess I'll discover as we go on. I think this talk is supposed to be, at least in my mind, a fairly light kind of souffle. You will be allowed, even encouraged to laugh, mainly laugh at me if you wish to. Very kindly, you've asked me to come back and give another talk, which will be a little bit more meaty. Maybe. I haven't written it yet, so we'll see how that goes. But that's going to be the one with more kind of heavier topics. This is meant to be fairly light. I don't normally talk about these things that happened 40, 50 years ago, but Jenny persuaded me otherwise, and there we are. Well, I first made my way to Zaire in early 1985. Zaire, which is now called, of course, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is the big green country in the heart of Africa. It's hot and very wet and sticky. In those days, Mobutu, who you can see on the screen, Mobutu Sese Seko, the president, ruled Zaire with an iron grip. I came face to face with him more than once, but this story is not really about him, much more about the people I met and the experiences I had. My speciality in days gone by was as a linguist, not really as a Bible translator, and it was as a junior linguist that I had just completed I think it was a 6-month internship in Brazzaville, in the neighboring Republic of the Congo, on the other side of the river. I have fond memories of Brazzaville because that was where I spent a lot of time learning Lingala. Lingala is the trade language, the language of wider communication, spoken all across the river area. It's the old colonial kind of invented language of the river Congo. And it was a language I came to enjoy and revel in even. It's a fun language. It's a relatively easy language. It's simplified. It's a pidgin. It's not necessarily, not originally anyone's mother tongue. So in 1985, I was, as I say, sent to Zaire, to Gemena, a town in the far northwest, the corner of the country is bordered by the river, by the bend in the river Ubangi. You can see it, it forms the border, the northwest border of the country. There were, the region is known as the Ubangi, and I shall refer to it as the Ubangi. There were, and still are, no roads from the north to the south of the country. It's impossible. There's a great big river, a huge river in the way. Access was either by commercial plane from Kinshasa or by charter flight from Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. I arrived in Bangui from Brazzaville and was met there by an MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship, Cessna plane. Now, in the 1950s, before I arrived, there had been a survey from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London that had produced a rather complex map of the languages spoken in the region. There we are on the screen. In the 1970s, the Protestant church in northwest Zaire had invited assistance from Wycliffe Bible Translators, the agency I was working with, to translate the Bible into 3 major languages of the region: Mbaka, Mbandi, and Mbanja. And once these projects were successfully launched, underway, help was again requested in identifying other languages of the region that might benefit from Bible translation. And I was the newbie assigned to tour the whole region and make a report. I was told it would take about 2 years to complete such a survey. By that time, I spoke a half-decent Lingala, but had no means of transport and, as yet, no one else to work with. But using Lingala and the French I had from my university and school days, I found it remarkably easy to talk with a wide range of people, speakers of nearly all those languages on the map there. There must be some 30 or 40 languages listed there. I found a particularly good source of eager helpers in the local colleges where students came from all over the Ubangi region. My first visit was to be by small plane, so I headed off once again with MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship, of what we used to call the broccoli patch. You can see it there. It looks just like broccoli when you're flying over it, the forest. Amazing sight. And we went to the small town of Bili, where there was to be a great big church jamboree. I could both join in the celebrations and start to make some preliminary investigations into who spoke what, the main language of that area was called Mono, who spoke it when, where, and so on. We made a stop along the way to pick up more passengers at a small mission station. 2 large people joined us, an American doctor and a local pastor, and off we went on our merry way. As we rose into the air, it crossed my mind, as it so often did in those days, are we really going to make it up over the top of the trees? When 5 seconds later we hit the ground again, I knew the pilot had had the same thought. I remember watching the trees of the forest speeding towards us, worryingly fast. However, the pilot was brilliant, and the plane came to a stop, upright, and mainly in one piece. Everyone, thankfully, escaped unhurt. But from that point on, MAF passengers in Central Africa always had to be weighed before they got onto the plane. It was in Bili that I preached my first sermon in Lingala. But my knowledge of the language, Lingala, still had many limits. I recall at the celebratory lunch, a wonderful lunch of boiled goat, being seated next to someone who I was told worked for Taba Zaire. Now, being a good Lingala student, I knew Taba was Lingala for goat. So I imagine this man must be in charge of some kind of large goat farm. And I asked him about his goats, and he said his wife had 3 of them, 3 left. Oh, I said, Tabazaya only has 3 goats. What happened to the 4th one? Are we eating it? He looked at me. I'm not sure whether it was annoyance or just polite puzzlement. Taba, not Ndaba. I am the local rep of the British American tobacco firm. Well, the next trip I went on had other challenges. By the time, this time, my new colleague, Jim, had arrived. We were to go on a visit to the so-called water people on the river Ngiri. These were people who lived in the swamplands between the great Congo River and the Ubangi River. There were no roads, no footpaths, just waterways. Everything was lived on and above water. We were expected in Limpopo, the market village, at the head of the river Ngiri. The church there prepared well for us, dugouts and deacons to paddle them and guide us, even a deaconess to cook for us. What more could we want? The senior missionary back in Gemina had been a bit concerned about me as a non-swimmer, supposed non-swimmer, and she'd insisted I take along a life jacket that she had sourced from I know not where. But we set off in the morning, me with my little life jacket and the head deacon with his wind-up tape recorder. I know I've told this story here before, but it was a tape recorder in which he had but one cassette that blasted out one English hymn, sung in English, and he liked playing it as loud as possible. So you have to imagine us in these dugouts canoes, making our way at a stately, sedate 2 miles an hour down the river, pounding out to all who might hear, I kid you not, Eternal Father, strong to save those in peril on the sea. I wish I had that videoed. The irony was further compounded when, after about an hour of paddling down this broad river, we entered the thick forest, and we all had to get out and push, because so shallow had the river become at this point. In fact, at this point, I took off my life jacket and found it made a passable cushion. Eventually, we arrived at a very remote village. As the welcoming villagers greeted us, I remember thinking, never before had I shaken hands with people who were dressed only in grass and leaves. It was really an extraordinary privilege to go to such a remote place. And another unusual thing about living in a swamp was where you bury your dead. If you dig down, you just come to water. So graves were mounds of earth upwards within the village. Anyway, Jim and I got down to work with our language survey. We played various recordings that I'd made in Gemina earlier to see what people understood and what languages they used where and when, and to check the differences in dialect and so on. Interestingly, we discovered each village had a slightly different way of speaking, a slightly different dialect. For instance, the word for palm oil was hali in one village, ali in another village, sali in a third. It was actually a Bible translator's nightmare. Each village with a slightly different variation of their language. But they welcomed us wonderfully, warmly, talked to us about what we asked them, talked to us about their hopes, their aspirations. They gave us a place to rest and shared their food with us. It was physically very, very challenging. The food was like nothing I had ever eaten anywhere else, and life was very simple. Well, really, what a privilege to have set foot in such a place. Once we were back in Gemina and I was busy writing up the results of our first full survey, we got news that the Toyota four-wheel drive that had been ordered for us had arrived in Bangui. We drove to Bangui on a borrowed motorbike. It was a 2-day journey, and in those days involved crossing the huge Lua River, which was always a challenge. We managed that all right, but rainy season had started, and the forest roads are really something else. There are huge potholes at the best of times. And in rainy season, of course, they get filled with water. And every time we came to a patch of water ahead of us, my job was to get off the bike. I was not driving the bike, Jim was doing that, and I had to test the depth of the water with a stick. I must have done this some 30 times and was getting rather tired of it. Look, I remember saying, this is clearly just a small puddle ahead, so we drove on into this small puddle, or rather down into it. The sticky red water was chest deep, neck deep really, and of course the motorbike ground to a dreadful halt. About 3 hours later, we were actually on our way again, but Jim and I now had bright red stripes or a stain right through everything we had, and right through our bodies as well. A few months later, I was told I needed to change the oil in this vehicle that we had been provided with, and I'm not a mechanic, but I was kind of pushed into doing this, dutifully got under the vehicle with a large bucket to catch the old oil. The bucket was indeed very large, just not large enough. These Toyota Land Cruisers have large engines. Anyway, I no longer had to worry about the red stain on my trousers. The new black one was covered it up very well. One thing I learned from all this, which was sometimes rather at odd with the self-sufficient outlook of many of the mission staff, never do yourself what somebody else can do. I quickly learned to delegate as much as I could to my Congolese friends. When I went on to live in MSC, it was very different. It wasn't possible to employ anyone. No one wanted to be tied down in that way, but they were willing to help and appreciated any reciprocal help I could offer. I recall one occasion when water had got into the diesel of the truck. It ground to a halt. But by then I knew so many people all over. Within 5 minutes, a mechanic I knew had appeared. He dug a hole in the road. I'd never have thought of that. Got underneath, removed the offending water in about 10 minutes flat. He was a real mechanic. On another more frightening occasion, the same truck that I was driving, rolled over as I started to climb a bank. I climbed that bank many a time beforehand, but it had rained very heavily, and in the rains the foundation had gone, and the bank collapsed. And I remember as I hung upside down in the cab of the truck, hearing someone shout out, "Ekufi Batobuni!" How many people have been killed? That was a terrifying moment. Actually, no one had been hurt at all. But since it was dark, we left the vehicle overnight, and then discovered in the morning that the battery acid had dripped just little drops onto the fuel filter, and it now leaked. And that was amazingly the only damage done to anywhere on the truck. The vehicle was parked outside the local dispensary, and I knew the nurse well. He was not a mechanic, so he offered me sticking plaster, which we put on the fuel filter, and I drove it round like that for 200 miles before I got back to a place where I could buy or get hold of a new fuel filter. It was so much easier when I could rely on the help of local people and work with them. It was a delight to do that, and they were delighted to be of help. The language survey was eventually completed. It's now published online, and though I'm embarrassed about some of the things in it, it's often quoted from and contains a lot of fairly unique data. Its immediate purpose was to report to the churches of the region what might be the next steps in Bible translation. And the next steps had gradually emerged as a new outreach amongst the Lobala people. I've lost my place here. There we go. Yes, a new outreach amongst the Lobala-speaking people. They were a group of about 70,000 people, all speaking much the same language, in an area that had been really quite neglected by the church. You can see them on that's the river Ubangi going through the middle there. They lived in an area that was really very hard to get to by vehicle, almost impossible, but the river itself provided like a great highway. You could go down that with great ease. The plan was for me to be part of a new team based in the village of Emesi. I came back to the UK to teach linguistics for 3 months, expecting to join a new team on my return. However, one by one, all the others who were expecting to be on the team pulled out. And so it was that I ended up with this unusual experience of living in the village of Emesi, as far away as you could get, really, from the big town of Gemena that I have told you about already. The local church built a house for me, gave me a wonderful welcome feast, and generally took great care of me. One of the experiences of local life that I occasionally enjoyed was fishing. Emesi is situated, as you saw, on the banks of the vast Ubangi River, maybe as much as 2 kilometers wide at some points, often full of fish. It puzzled me, therefore, that family groups would disappear into the forest, away from the river, and emerge after 2 or 3 days with vast amounts of fish. And bizarrely, this happened in the middle of dry season, when forest paths were dry. There were no rivers in the forest, and I had to find out what was going on. I was invited to join the pastor's family group, and we set off early in the morning. By afternoon, we had arrived at a pond. It was way off the main path of the forest, and to my mind, did not look like a very promising place to go fishing. It was not large, maybe the size of this church, this room here. No streams flowed into it or out of it, rather dirty looking. One of the taller youngsters strode into the middle of the pond and planted a long stick in the middle. That will show us how deep it is, I was told. Then a number of the young women sat down on the bank of the pond, made themselves comfortable, and waited while two of the other men waded into the edge of the pond. Each had a locally woven basket in their hands, a traditional basket. Then they scooped down into the water, scooped up a basket full of water, and then threw it up to the women. Shrieks of laughter as the women tossed the water over their backs and away from the pond. Again and again, water was scooped up and thrown out. As I watched, I have to say with some bewilderment, I realized I was observing a kind of human pump. Water went everywhere, but mainly out of the pond. Everyone was drenched. Shifts changed faster and faster. They went on and on. Water down, up, over, out, down, up, over, out. Other activities were available. Women cooked food and men made makeshift huts for the night. Even I made my own little shelter for the night. At about 10 o'clock, most retired to sleep, but the pump work carried on right through the night, a bit more quietly than at first, I'm glad to say. By mid-morning, about 18 hours of human pumping had gone by, and I could make out the floor of the pond. It was very muddy, and you could see a few fat catfish flopping around in the mud. They were quickly passed on to the women who dispatched them and started to smoke them for eating later. Well, I thought to myself, what a lot of fuss and bother to get a few fish. Never before had I seen such an inefficient fishing process, I thought. Normally where I come from, the idea is to get the fish out of the water. Here, they seem to want to get the water out of the pond. But as I looked down from the bank into the pond, I saw the men clearing the mud away and opening up what looked like boxes. There were a series of enclosures, one might say traps, in which were caught hundreds and hundreds of great big catfish. And the rest of the day was spent dispatching and smoking this huge number of fish. It went on all night, in fact. The next day we packed up and returned to the village with a vast amount of fish that could be eaten or sold to passing boats going downriver to Kinshasa. I later understood that there were also ponds that were regarded as taboo, never to be fished from, never to be touched. And these were the breeding grounds. When the rains came each year, the younger fish would swarm across the forest and all be covered in water. And then when the waters withdrew during dry season, the fish would retreat to hide in these man-made ponds. It was a traditional fish farm, and the wisdom of the ancestors was indeed impressive. And it was not the first time that an outsider comes along and thinks what these people are doing makes no sense at all. It must be replaced with some sound Western thinking. But the reality, if I but looked, was that here indeed was true wisdom that could be built on and used to enrich people's lives. I remember once sitting at a family dispute. Somebody had accused their wife of causing some trouble and had sent them back. But the in-laws found that there was fault with the man. And the details don't matter, but the process I want to briefly refer to does. I listened as the issue was introduced by the head of the family into the circle of family elders. Each one in turn then expressed a view of some kind, maybe pointing out one thing or another. It came back to the head of the family, and he spoke at greater length, incorporating much of what had been said and expressing a consensus. And then, as each spoke again in turn, they expressed their support for what the head elder had said. This smooth process contrasts rather favorably with what I recall of some church council meetings I sat in on, which had a habit of going on into the early hours, resulting often in huge arguments or things left unresolved. If only they'd been encouraged to use a traditional way of coming to a consensus. That's not to say that life was always peaceful and happy. I recall once waking up in the middle of the night. The forest, the river, and the village had been eerily engulfed with wailing. The wife of a young deacon, a teacher at the primary school, had suddenly died in the middle of the night. At first light, I went to sit at the teacher's compound, and later in the day, I noticed a lot of tension in the air, people gathering, there were arguments, there was shouting. And then several boats from downriver were spotted. They were from the neighboring village of Mokolo, the home village of the woman that had died. The boats from Mokolo landed, and men made their way at speed to the house where the body was. Then they proceeded to make off with the body, rushing back to the beach where the boats were. But crowds had gathered, and there was scuffling, fighting, and then shots were fired. The body was dropped on the ground. The Battle of Emesi had begun. There is a small army base in Emesi with about a dozen soldiers, and the commander was a good man. One of his soldiers had fired his gun to stop what was basically a riot. The invaders were ordered to leave the body alone and were sent home. This was all a new experience for me, but it gave me an insight into the tensions that neighboring villages could sometimes feel towards each other. Like elsewhere, there was a lot of history behind where people lived and who had what rights to what land, and indeed rights to a dead body. Tragedy, and there always seemed to be a funeral every day in the village, mainly small children. Tragedy was something that can be felt universally across different cultures. It brings people together like nothing else. Humor, on the other hand, does not cross the cultural divide so well. I had one of those Gestetner duplicating machines for a while. They were very messy to operate. Do you remember them? And I had a helper, a young fellow, probably about 15 years old or something, used to help me with it. As he squirted the black ink into the machine, I quipped, you know, that makes a fine shampoo for black hair. I saw the fellow the next day. He did look a bit odd. He sidled up to me and said, "That shampoo you recommended, it doesn't work very well." Be careful with humor. Did I ever do any work, you might ask? Well, and what exactly was my work? In the first 2 years of my time in MSc, so that's 87 to 89, I was mainly involved in linguistic and cultural research. That was, in part, the justification for going on things like that fishing trip. It provided so much insight into the culture and social life of the Lobala-speaking people. I wrote these experiences up in short anthropological papers. I collected items for a dictionary and folk stories for analysis, and I later published these collections for the community, and they've also been published more widely. I also wrote a few linguistic articles, and here, I think on the screen, is a very simple example of some sentences from Lobala, and I thought it might be interesting for you to see this because it relates to one of the points I want to make. Just to try you out, what do we got there? I think Nakumi Munkanda, which means I'm writing a letter. Nakumaka Munkanda Yana. You can read what that means, I think. Na Bumakang Babi Yana. Na Batumaka Munkanda Yana. Batuming Babi. And Bamu Bumang Babi Yana. So my question to you, I've got several questions. What do you think is the Lobala for yesterday when you look at that? Yana. Absolutely right. What is the Lobala for tomorrow? Yana. The same. Yes. Actually, the same the day after tomorrow, and the day before, the day after tomorrow, and the day before yesterday, also the same word. Not the same word, it's Ndele. Yes, and it works fine because it's always associated with a verb or some other future thing. It's never, no one ever had any difficulty with the same word meaning or having. It basically means one thing. It means one day away. So then, another question: what is the Lobala for letter? Yes, I hear it. Munkanda. Good. You see, it's not difficult. And the Lobala for monkey? Babi. I think that's more than just Lobala. You'll find that word elsewhere. Okay, and these are easy words. Nouns, on the whole, are relatively easy things to get hold of when you learn a language. Relatively easy. The difficulty comes always with the verb. The verb is complex. The verb is where you get all kinds of variations and subtleties and nuances. Right. So, you look at the verb words, which are all on the left, conveniently, and you can tell me, let's see, what's the next thing? Oh, it's come up on the screen already. What's the Lobala for they? It's a universal in Bantu languages as far as I'm aware. Ba. Ba. As in Bantu. It's the plural, third person plural marker. And na is, that's on the screen, is I, yeah. And that's in more languages than just Lobala. Good. And then we come to, let's see if I get the order right. What's the next one? I'm not sure what you can. Yes, it's the verb word. So what you think is the verb root send? That's the most challenging question maybe I've asked you, but someone's saying something. Tome, almost. Tome is you've got an ending on it. It's just that T-O-M, tum, is the verb root, and it can have any kind of ending on it. We'll keep an A on it because it has to have some ending. Yes, toma is to send. Yeah, that's straightforward. And then the little future marker, did you see that? It goes before the verb. Mu. Namutu mamukanda yana. I will send a letter tomorrow. That's accurate Lobala, but it's very simplified. I can assure you the real thing is complex. But one thing that the riches that I discovered in looking closely at a language such as Lobala, still to this day blows my mind away. The variation, how you get great subtlety and storytelling is wonderful. I also investigated other things, such as what we call discourse features in Lobala, and this is about how you join up sentences or ideas in speech. So we're talking about the equivalent of and but and even and also. And we gloss over these things so often when we learn languages, but it's utterly essential to know how you're going to use them if you're going to start a Bible translation project. And it's often the hardest thing to get right, even if you're a mother tongue speaker, because you tend to copy the original. You tend to copy what you're translating rather than your own language. So that's very important. It's good to exploit the riches of a language to bring out the very best. And so I've written a little article in this book edited by my colleague Stephen Levinson. But the most challenging thing I dealt with as far as language was concerned was tone shift. Bantu languages typically have what are called high and low tones associated with each syllable. It's a bit like stress in English. So in English, we all know the difference between project and project, right? You work on a project, but you project a missile. Same word, different stress. And the stress changes the meaning, or at least how we use the word. In Lingala, you'd say Nayemba, meaning I sang, but Nayemba, meaning I might sing. Now, in some languages, and Lobala is one of them, the tone tier, the tones associated with the syllable, can move around. Sounds horrific? It is horrific, if you're not a mother tongue speaker. The tone, it can move, and tones are actually sounded not on the syllable that they're associated with, but the next one. It took me a long time to work this out and to grasp what was going on. In 1994, I spent 4 weeks in Cameroon. I was working with a tone expert from Canada called Keith Snyder, and I took a young man, Bolobo Nyanga, there he is, along with me as a native speaker of Lobala, and together we spent hours analyzing speech patterns using machinery and the wisdom of Keith Snyder. The good news is that it actually doesn't make a lot of difference in the way the language is written. But it was an important thing to understand. Well, what about Bible translation itself? I've often said my role in the whole project was simply in helping select a young man, Balobo, and point him in the right direction. I'd known him since he was about 15 years old. His parents were amongst my most faithful friends, and I trusted he would see the project through to completion, which he did in 2022. The process was interrupted by the terrible civil war between 1997 and 2007, but the time when Balobo trained, that was the time during the war when Balobo trained. He gained an MA, amongst other things, in Bible translation from Africa International University in Kenya. We'd done some early translation before 1995 together in MSc. I recall one of my favorite moments from that time was when we tested the parable of the sower with a group of village elders. They told me they understood the sower to have gone out to the fields, found some rocky ground, and for some reason, a little bit unclear to them, carefully planted the seed in the rocks, only to discover that, well, obviously the seed had not done very well. Why had he done this? Well, this is the word of God. We don't question God. But now in this translation, we read that the sower came along and broadcast the seed everywhere, generously, indiscriminately. Now we understand. I have to say what Balobo Nyanga did without me was much better than what I did. He sorted out some of the orthography issues. He worked with the Catholic Church, got an ecumenical team together. He made excellent use of computers, moved to the big town Gemena because that was where you could get things done. And the New Testament took a very long time to get to the printers and then to get to back to the people. But finally, in 2021, I think it was, not 2022, it was launched in two amazing ceremonies, one in Gemena and the other in Imesi. And I did once show you a film of one of the ceremonies. Some concluding thoughts. You will have noticed that I have portrayed myself from time to time as the bumbling outsider, constantly making mistakes and getting into difficulties. And that is how it feels when you operate in a culture that is very different from the one you grew up in. But you will also have noticed that there was a lot of intimacy moments, times when I was able to share meaningfully, intimately even, with people, with the church, with the community. I often used to say, never underestimate the cultural gap. You are going to be misunderstood and you are going to misunderstand. Equally, don't underestimate the possibility of enjoying, living, engaging meaningfully with a very different culture. A cross-cultural worker is uniquely placed to bridge that gap and maybe to help people understand others. You will also have noticed the challenges of living in this part of the world. Life is unbelievably hard. An unforgiving climate, horrendous health issues. I've not talked about malaria, but I indirectly referred to the infant mortality that is a result of malaria, and I only hope and pray that this new medicine vaccination will be effective in reducing infant death or child death. Terrific communication problems. Think of, I described roads and airplanes, that everything is difficult when you're trying to move around and get things, or to communicate through radio and television and press. These things, at least in those days, did not work at all well. And then you combine all those things and more with a terrible legacy from colonial times. The colonial legacy in Congo is probably probably the worst in the whole of Africa. A world today that, frankly, is interested in the country as a resource for mineral wealth and not much else. But the other thing I want to stress in my closing remark is the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that is holed up in each of and every culture. The tragedy is that that wisdom is so often regarded as useless in today's world, dismissed as not worth the bother. If I but focus on language, the Lobala-speaking people have a wonderful resource in the language they speak. Modern society would crush that and see it as an irrelevance or even as an obstacle to development. It may be that the result of translating the scriptures into a local language is, first and foremost, a restatement of the value of that local language and the value of that local community. You give people the dignity to express the world in the way, in their own words. You allow children to learn to read in their own language rather than a foreign language. You give people the confidence to see their own worth vis-a-vis other cultures. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been the privilege of my life to live and work in Emesi. And I have to say, it isn't in my script here, the one reason I was able to do that was the support of, Margaret, I think, was probably one of the people around when I first went, and the support of Cupid Green Church was phenomenal. And then Hampstead Methodist Church took on some of that support in later years. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, David. We may have some questions.
Yes, that's fine.
Do you have a microphone on? Or yes, you do.
I do.
So that's all right. So I can steal this one.
Yes.
For the moment. I am just checking. There are a few people online who might also have some questions for you as well. Can I start by saying thank you? Absolutely fascinating talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it is lovely to hear not only something of this other culture that many of us haven't experienced, but also to hear your joy and your enthusiasm for having been through all that. I have to say that for a moment you got me very excited at the start because you started talking about oil changes. And those of you here in the congregation will know that I'm very, very excited about I was a motor mechanic and I love those sort of things.
I wish you'd been there.
I was really thinking it was going to be a talk about servicing Toyota Land Cruisers. And I can only express my slight disappointment that then you went on onto this other stuff. But, hey.
David, the problem would have been you'd have taken it apart so many times. The days you needed it, it wouldn't be available.
So we'll open the floor to a few questions. I want to start the ball rolling by simply asking a very pragmatic thing, was that you mentioned the aeroplane that didn't quite clear the trees. There was an incident with a vehicle on its side. Yep. The sticky plaster, brilliant. That's lovely. I just wonder, how many times did you feel that your life was genuinely at risk? And did you feel a sense of fear? You treat it very lightly in your conversation, but I just wondered how you dealt with perhaps that.
Good question. I think on the whole, I'm always slightly worried about aeroplanes. They seem so unnatural to me.
Yeah, me too.
I wonder why I wasn't more frightened, because I think probably one of the more frightening things was the habit of some people when we had these dugout canoes with outboard motors on them.
Yes.
Going up there, just to be smoking and right next to the petrol did rather alarm me.
Right.
But anyway, I think I don't really think any of those. I think I made light of them. They were serious. They were potentially awful things. I think where I felt frightened was probably from malaria. Malaria, is a very serious disease, and I had that many times. And on a few occasions, I really didn't think I'd make it. So that, I think, probably more frightening and I didn't talk about that.
Yes. And
But
yeah.
the other thing that is certainly is some of the civil unrest that happened in the 97 time, a bit later than what I was referring to, when there was gunfire. Not in that part of the world. Well, there was, but I wasn't there. The whole village evacuated. But that village had actually been bombed by an Antonov aeroplane in about 2000. But some of my colleagues got stuck in gunfire. They weren't being fired at. The gun was going over them, but over them and not very politely over, if you get my meaning.
Yeah.
It was going anywhere. And
Well, what goes up must come down.
That's very
isn't it?
frightening.
Yeah.
When guns are going off. And I wasn't in that situation, but it could easily have been. That's definitely frightening.
I think you give us a sense of an enormous courage. Maybe in your faith you stepped out, and you know, there's an idea, isn't there, that there's a sort of an umbrella of faith that perhaps protects us from some things. But
yes. I mean, I don't think I would knowingly take foolish risks. It may sound like I did, but I don't think I would do that. I think I was fairly careful. And there were some things like the life jacket, which I'd make light of because that was fairly ridiculous. And I don't think the river really, that was a relatively small river. Anyway, yes. Now I think what do we say? I forget not risk averse. You don't look for risk, but you will take some risks to a point, but not. You don't stay in. If you're risk averse, totally risk averse, you'd stay at home and do nothing.
yes,
We all go and cross the road, and that takes courage sometimes. But there's some kind of middle path there.
Yeah. Thank you. Having been someone who managed to fall in the canal here on a church trip down the canal, I'm thinking that I'm probably, it is good that we were called to our different ministries. I suspect that I would have got into some situations and you probably had the sense to avoid them, so well done. And I think we're called perhaps in different ways, but yes, amazing, and your courage is incredible.
And more missionaries are killed by road accidents than anything else.
Right.
Just to put that in context.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? I think there is a microphone wandering around. If anyone would like to raise a question.
Did your wife accompany you on these travels?
Well, I met my wife in Africa. She was working on another project, and so we met in 1993. I was this strange single guy who went off and did funny things, and she was a strange single lady who went off and did funny things. And said, "Oh, lovely." And we
So
got married.
while you were doing your strange things, what did she do to occupy herself? Did she work?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
While you were doing these strange things, what did she do? Did she work? Did she,
We weren't married when I was doing these
Right.
strange things. This is in the 80s. So we were married in 1995. And then we spent a year in Britain, and then the war began, civil war. And I was asked, I haven't told this bit of the story, but others might know it, I was asked then to take over some of the leadership of that group in that part of the world, which was a bit of a poison chalice when we weren't in the country, and I had to persuade people not to go back and to work in a completely different way, but that's another story. And she was, we had children fairly early on, both being somewhat older, and so the children did. She's been working now. When I'm retired, she's a bit younger, so she's now working full time.
Very practical arrangement, I think, that to, well done, well arranged. Yes, thank you. Any other questions?
I've got a thing to add to what I should have said at the beginning, and that's to remind folks that we have a retiring collection. You can also make donations on the card reader,
and whatever's collected this evening will go to David's charity of his choice, which I probably suspect might be Wycliffe, but I'm not preempting it.
We actually had this conversation before, and I believe that you were having a think.
Well, I was. Do you mind if I say I would appreciate? Well, Salvation Army is one of my favourite charities. If you don't mind, I said this church. Nothing against Wycliffe. I have retired now. My wife still works with Wycliffe, but you have given an awful lot to Wycliffe, and I would suggest, if you, bearing that in mind, Salvation Army, which is a charity I admire and try to support.
Thank you very much, and that actually fits rather well with the fact that later in the series we've got a speaker from the Salvation Army talking about their work.
They may be too modest
overseas. I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll just do one final check to see if it's. Oh, we've got. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, we've got one here and one there.
David, you just mentioned the Salvation Army. Were they active in the area that you were working in Africa?
Not in northwest Zaire or Congo. They were active in Brazzaville, very much so, yes.
Yeah.
There were 4 churches allowed in Brazzaville in those days. I think it's changed now. I think they have much more freedom, but it was fairly strict communist days in the early 1980s. Yes, they had a big work there in Brazzaville. Very impressive. I went to quite a few of their meetings.
Okay. Now I ask because we had some friends who worked in Haiti, and they actually were working alongside the Salvation Army, and I'd never imagined, I don't know why, in my stupidity, I didn't put Salvation Army and difficult tropical countries in the same sentence, so I just made me wonder.
Yes, thank you. And yes, and Andrew. For anyone watching online, there is now some jogging going on as the microphone goes a long way away.
It's all right, by the magic of the... they can see me because there's a camera on the laptop. Anyway, David, 2 questions. I'll ask the second one first, and then you'll have to come back to me so you know what the first question was. The second question was, why is it called pigeon? What is the significance of the word pigeon, and what does it really mean?
I didn't get the word, Andrew.
Pigeon.
Pigeon.
Oh, pigeon.
So I think you referred it to as a pigeon.
Lingala is a pigeon. Yes, that's it's a manufactured language. It was a language that grew up. I cannot remember. I think I did look it up once. I cannot remember the etymology of the word pigeon, where that came from. But it's like a lingua franca. It's a language spoken over a wider area that is no one person's mother tongue necessarily, and it grew up. It has bits of Bantu languages in it from around the whole river area. It's got bits of Portuguese in it, and bits of Arabic, and bits of French. Not so much French, really. Portuguese, it goes back a long way, and all sorts of other things thrown in.
Okay, now the first question, which is more deep. I mean, how did you translate kind of abstract concepts like justification,
Yes.
for example?
Yes. Or indeed, the Lobala language is tremendously rich in some ways, because hundreds and hundreds of words for different trees and fish. Unfortunately, as you kind of imply, these words don't come very much in the Bible. So where Paul especially loves his abstract Greek thinking, you have to turn them into verbs sometimes. So you may have to express them as a phrase. Or you may coin, there may be a word, a loan word. There are all kinds of tricks of the trade. But turning an abstract word into a small phrase with a verb may be what you have to do.
We've got one more, and then we must. I think we should. Yeah. Otherwise, I think Andrew might have a list of questions that will.
He had 6.
I forgot what it is now.
Uh-oh.
Were you translating from Greek or were you translating from English?
Always translate from Greek if it's the New Testament, but we also had on the table umpteen versions in French. In those days, we had a table with books there, and it was quite complicated. These days, you just need a laptop, and everyone has a laptop, and you can. The Bible Society produce these programs which have huge numbers of things. But no, you'd normally translate from the Greek, or at least you'd have the Greek on the table. Not everyone may understand the Greek, but that's your reference point.
Well, thank you. I think we should draw the questions now to a close. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Just before you go, we're going to just briefly pray for the work that you've done and for you, and then we will express our thanks one more time. So let us pray. Lord God, Almighty Father and Creator, we thank you for David, for what he has brought us. We thank you for his ministry. And we ask and bring prayers for all of those places, the multitude of different villages that David has discussed and opened up to us. And we pray for the work of spreading the Bible across the world and translating it into so many languages. And we bring these prayers in the name of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So one last time, David, thank you ever so much. And we are very grateful for all that you're doing.